Okay, so we're looking at 2 Kings 24 and 25, 2 Chronicles 36, Psalm 74 and 79, Jeremiah 33 to 47, and Habakkuk 1 to 3. So that's all of the book of Habakkuk. And the idea, of course, for the year is finding our footing. We're trying to figure out how to face the challenges of the world and do so in a way that's strategic, so we can hopefully understand whatever challenges we face, we can be ready for them. And that is something that we all have to recognize. Whether we have persecution from people around us or not, that's really not the issue, even though that is an important part of the focus. The issue is really, are we going to present ourselves in the best footing? And we're talking about this quarter about training from God, the way that God trains us to be better and to grow, and how He trains us. And God expects for us to teach each other, and we may do it in various ways, but God's not going to send us a video or a message telling us this is what we need to do. He's already sent the message. And so He does that, but He does that also through training, He does that training through the processes of life that we go through. And if we are aware, astute, we can compare what we're going through with what the Scriptures teach, and then we can learn tremendous amounts. But sometimes we don't really think to connect the two for some reason. And that's what we're trying to do. And the theme for this month has been letting suffering deepen our roots. So we've been talking about how that suffering can actually make you dig down deeper and be a stronger person. And then this week it's about turning pain into power. And that's actually what the lesson's about, the sermon this morning. And this afternoon is related to that as well. And it certainly relates to what they're going through here in the reading section. So 2 Kings 24 and 25 and 2 Chronicles 36 are parallel passages. There's a little bit more information, and that there's some information in one that's not in the other, and vice versa. But we have Jehoiakim's subordination to Babylon, and then we have Jehoiakim became king for 3 months, and he was taken prisoner by Nebuchadnezzar, and everyone in Jerusalem except the poorest of the land were taken to Babylon. So this is the end. There were basically three waves of attack, and they weren't all back to back. I mean, there were years in between them. But the first time was when Nebuchadnezzar defeated the army, the Assyrian army and Pharaoh Necho, defeated them and marched to Jerusalem and encircled it and took away some captives. And then in those captives we have people like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, some of the royalty, and subordinated the king and put his own king in, actually. And then about 15 years later, I don't remember exactly the timing, happened again because of rebellion. Then about 11 years after that, there was another rebellion, and so this is when Jehoiachin was put into as king, and he was taken prisoner by Nebuchadnezzar because he rebelled. And this is when he said, all right, we're done. He destroyed everything and took everybody captive that was of any importance at all. The only people that were left were the poor people who could just barely survive. So he is clean house. And then we have Mattaniah. This is Jehoiachin's uncle, and he was made king by Nebuchadnezzar, and they changed his name to Zedekiah. And after 11 years, Zedekiah rebelled against Babylon's rule, and we have that's the second one. The third one is Zedekiah's rule. Zedekiah rebelled against Babylon and set the stage for the complete destruction of Jerusalem. Babylon besieged Jerusalem for 2 years until the city wall was breached. And this is when people began to run, and a lot of them were captured. The book of Joel, I believe, mentions that the punishment that comes, Obadiah mentions the punishments coming to people because who are not Jewish, they were stopping the Jews from being able to escape from Jerusalem. And so there's a lot of things happening in that section. We have Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard for Babylon. He burned the temple and all the great houses of Jerusalem. He broke down the walls, and they took away all the tools and utensils of the temple. They had already begun to, they didn't destroy the temple, but they had destroyed a lot of the houses, the great houses that were inside the city because of the siege. They had to build siege walls to keep the Babylonians out. So they started actually dismantling a lot of their houses to do this, the rich people's houses, because these are the largest walls, and they started using that to fortify. So there was already a lot of this being torn down, and this is what God, of course, had predicted that was going to happen. And then they took away all the tools and the utensils of the temple that we'll see later on in the book of Daniel. They're actually using them. This is at the very end of actually Daniel chapter 5, but at the end of the reign of the Babylonians, we have the writing on the wall and things like this. The reason for the writing on the wall, the hand that just appeared and wrote, "Many, many tickle you farson, your time is at hand." It was because they were using these things that that had been taken out of the temple. And they were toasting other gods based on this. So there's quite a bit of history that's there. And then 2 Chronicles ends, there's a massive exodus to Egypt and from the surrounding area of Judah. So there were a lot of people who, not in Jerusalem itself, but outside of Jerusalem, that they went to Egypt because they had to go somewhere. And they were afraid of what was happening. Instead of giving up and going to Babylon, which God actually told them to do, they decided to run and go to Egypt. And do you remember who it was, a notable figure that was taken to Egypt at this time? I may say a lot of people, but this is one we've actually discussed a little bit before, if anybody can remember. Been a couple weeks. This is when Jeremiah was actually taken to Egypt, and he did not want to go, but he was an old man. He'd been preaching. I think he preached 52 years. So he was an older man, and he didn't have a choice. They said, "You're going with us." So he went and evidently died there in Egypt. There's a lot of interesting history with the Jews that when they went to Egypt, they weren't technically called Jews at the time, but they became known as the Jews after the Judean captivity. And one of the most important places, I'm trying to remember right now where it was. Joe, you might remember. Where was it that the Septuagint was translated? Was it Alexandria? Yeah. So there's a huge group of Jews that settled into Alexandria in Egypt. And it was a thriving city, and it was there for a long time. And they, at one point, they translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek. Now, this would have been later on, but they translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek, and they did it supposedly they did it in 70 days. So if you know anything about translating books, it's going to take a while. And they saw this actually as kind of a miraculous thing, that they could do this entire Old Testament in 70 days. There were a lot of errors and problems with it that we've been able to see, and not just English people saying there are errors in it. The Hebrews recognized there are errors in it, but they still believed that this was by the hand of God. And it was one of the great things about that was the people, especially later on when the Greeks had conquered the world and the Romans had come over and taken their place. Many people spoke Greek. Many Jews spoke Greek around the world, and so now they have a way to communicate, and they have a way to see the Hebrew Scripture. A lot of them had lost the language, the Hebrew language. So they had the Greek, and this Greek Old Testament was actually the one that Jesus read when he was growing up, and he taught from that translation, and that's the one that Paul and Timothy and other people had been taught from youth. They'd been taught the Scriptures. More than likely, it was the Greek translation that was made that came out of this, and it happened because there was a Jewish settlement in Alexandria, and the reason there was a Jewish settlement in Alexandria was because of these events that are going on here. So that one after another, event after another, we can see how all these things unfolded. And even though, interestingly enough, even though the Greek translation, the Septuagint, the word Septuagint means 70, And that's the reason they call it the Septuagint, was because of the 70 days that it took to translate, which is absolutely amazing that they did this. And so it's also called, sometimes you might see a reference to LXX. That's another way of referencing the Septuagint, which the LXX is just the Roman numerals for 70. That's where it comes from. Some people say Septuagint, some people say Septuagint, but it's all the same thing. Joe, you look like you're wanting to add something to that.
Apparently, whenever Alexander on his march eastward, when he got to Jerusalem, the high priest, because of the prophecies in Daniel, he said, "We've been expecting you."
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
And so I'm sure that's when Alexander made the decision that he was going to have all of his really smart people to translate the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah, I'd forgotten about that. That's right. They supposedly met him on his way down, and his intention was to destroy Jerusalem. And they met him with the Bible, said, "We're reading about you right here," and it said, "You're going to go on and conquer the world." And so he let them live because of that, and decided to. That's right. I've forgotten about that. Thank you. Anyway, it's amazing how history works, and from then on, I don't know if it was before this or after this, but he considered himself to be sent by God to conquer the world. You know, it's interesting how Nebuchadnezzar believed the same thing. And did God say he sent him to destroy the world? Yeah, he did. So I don't know where they got their information. I don't know if God revealed himself. I don't know if other prophets or they just happen to have a Hebrew scripture. I have no idea. Yeah. Yeah, Cyrus was mentioned too. And it could be that that's one of the reasons he decided to do the way he did. That's right. Yeah. Oracles? Yeah, they did. Yeah. The question is whether God spoke to them or not. I don't know. But they learned something somehow, and it's pretty amazing. Yeah.
You know, one of the things that is amazing me about dealing with problems of Almighty God, and I wasn't smart enough to come to this realization myself. There was an engineer I worked with out in the plant, very about Baptist. He pointed this out to me. But Hezekiah, Plato, and Confucius all lived within 250 years of here on planet Earth. Okay, so is that coincidence or is that the providence?
That's interesting. Yeah.
What I believe. Okay.
Yeah.
It's problem.
Yeah, and you think about philosophy. Go ahead.
No, I mean, to me that just shows God was concerned about not only the Jews, because and we know that he chose the Jews because they were going to be the people who brought the Messiah to earth.
Yeah.
But this other shows that God was concerned about everybody on the planet.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And we have plenty of evidence in the Old Testament showing us that God was concerned about more than just the Jews, but they were his primary concern. That's true. And, you know, someone had said that philosophy had really risen to its peak and had nowhere else to go until Jesus showed up on the scene, and everything changed after that because of his teaching. And it was, you might can see some of the teachings that he had in some of the other philosophers that came before him, but his message was completely different and really revolutionized thinking. And so, yeah, I think God had worked through history to bring about these great teachers and leaders of people in different places. That it's really fascinating to look at. And then the book of 2 Chronicles ends with the proclamation of Cyrus. And of course, Cyrus is the one who, 150 years before he came into power, is predicted that he would be the one to release the Jews and send them home. Now, it specifically said that Cyrus would release the Jews, and Cyrus's decree was really for all peoples, but it certainly included the Jewish people, so we can't say that was in any way inaccurate. Then we have Psalms 74 and 79. This is the Psalm of Asaph. Asaph lived in the time of David, so there's some discrepancy here. We're not exactly sure. I'm not sure when they put these psalms together with this, if it was topically put together or if this man had some evidence that these were the same time frame. It's a possibility. It does seem like it's from the same time frame. So some people actually believe that these are prophetic, talking about the things that were happening with the Babylonian captivity. Some people believe that, so that would have been written by Asaph. Some people believe that the Psalms were attributed to him, but is more like stylistically, instead of him writing it, maybe it was the same kind of style as Asaph. Other people believe that maybe this was the descendants of Asaph who had been trained by Asaph, who taught other people. So there was a line of like a group of people had been trained to do this kind of prophecy. We don't really know, but it says Asaph, but it is definitely talking about things related to Babylonian captivity. So it could have been simply prophecies. And these two chapters or two psalms are pleas for God to remember Mount Zion that was defiled and destroyed. And so that's what these really are. Yeah.
You know, Jason, I mean, the Pharisees, they regarded all of the 39 books of the Old Testament as being inspired by God, inspired by the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
But the Sadducees apparently didn't. They just believed in the first 5 books.
True.
The law of Moses.
Yeah, that's right. The Sadducees didn't believe in a lot of things, and they only took the first 5. The rest of it was commentary to them. And
But the Pharisees, they adamantly believed that
oh yeah,
the other 34 books, that they were inspired by God.
yeah, that's right. And it was very commonly believed by most of the people who were alive in the time of Jesus. All right, then we have Jeremiah 34 through 37. There's a lot going on in Jeremiah. But we have, in chapter 33, we have promises of restoration that were given. That Jeremiah said, yeah, you're going to go into captivity, but you're going to come out of captivity. We have prophecies about Zedekiah being taken to Babylon but not killed. That's in chapter 34. This was to help quiet his mind, I guess, to help him know what was going to happen. Then we have the faithfulness of the Rechabites in chapter 35, contrasted with Judah's unfaithfulness. You remember the Rechabites? What was it the comparison was made? Who were the Rechabites, or what were they known for? Do you remember? They were a group of people who, because of the father, I believe his father's name was Rechab, had entreated them or charged them not to drink alcohol of any kind. And this was not, and the word is wine, so we're not sure if he meant not to drink anything that came from the grape, which would also include more than what we'd call wine, but they were not allowed to drink it, and they, for generations, had not touched it. And so there's a comparison that was made by Jeremiah. Said, here's a man who charged his children not to eat it, not to drink any of this stuff, and they haven't touched it. And if you compare them to Israel or to Judah, he says, I've been telling you for generations not to touch these things, these false gods, and you're all over touching them. So he was contrasting them and holding up the Rechabites as people who were to be imitated. Then we have King Jehoiakim, who burns Jeremiah's prophecies, and they were written again with more added this time. So Berechiah actually helped in writing of those things, but this is Jehoiakim burning the prophecies. And then we have Egypt's entry into the area that caused Babylon to pull away, and so there was a give and take. There's a push and pull between Egypt and Babylon in that area in chapter 37. And then Jeremiah was put into a cistern in chapter 38, and some of the princes of Judah tried to kill him. That's why they threw him in there. And it was a cistern without water, but there was a lot of mud in the bottom of it, so he was sinking in, and they were afraid he was going to die, so they some people got him out. And we have the fall of Jerusalem in 39. Then 40 and 41, Jeremiah he chose to stay in Jerusalem instead of going into Babylon. And Gedaliah was appointed governor. He was assassinated also shortly after. Then the remnant of the area fled to Egypt, and that's 42 and 43 and 44. And then there was a message sent to Jeremiah's scribe, Baruch, in chapter 45. And then in 46 and 47, we have prophecies against Egypt and the Philistines. So they're going to get theirs too. That's coming up. Then we have the book of Habakkuk, which we're getting into chapter 3. Habakkuk starts off with complaints against God. And this would, of course, been before the fall of Jerusalem, but it's in this time frame. The complaint was that how terrible Israel is and how terrible Judah is and the people that are there. And one of the questions is, God, how can you allow these things to continue on? And we've asked similar questions, I'm sure, right? How do we look around in this world? How much longer do we have? And Carl and I were talking about that just the other day. There's so many bad things that are happening, and it seems like it's just getting worse. And so, what do we do? And this is a question that Habakkuk's asking, and of course he didn't like the answer. God came to him and said, "They're going to be punished." He said, "I'm sending the Babylonians to punish them." And then this made it even worse for him, because now he's thinking, why would you send a terribly ungodly, a worse people to destroy people who are actually better? Because and it's not nearly as bad as all that. They're a whole lot worse than we are. And of course, the answer to that came that God is the one who's in control. That's basically the message of Habakkuk. And that when the fulfillment of the destruction comes from Babylon also is going to face destruction and punishment for their sins. And so, generally speaking, how does God work with nations in bringing about punishments? That's right. War, famine, and disease, and a little bit of all of that. But mostly it's war. And war is a terrible, terrible thing to be a part of. Not that I've ever been there, but I just know. And we all know that. And looking at the atrocities that are coming on, I mean, the Assyrians were punished, and they had a reason to be punished. They were terrible people. They were punished by the Babylonians. And who was it that punished the Babylonians for their sins? You remember? The Persians. Yeah. Now, the Medo-Persian Empire came after them, and they spread around the world. But who was it that came and destroyed the Persians? The Greeks, with Alexander the Great specifically. And then we have there was some division after Alexander's death. It divided into 4 kingdoms, but there was punishment that came. The Syrians were there in north of Israel as part of they actually were part of the Greek Empire, and they caused lots and lots of trouble for Jerusalem. And the king of Egypt also, they were fighting in between each other, and Jerusalem was kind of in the middle. So there's lots of things going on there, but who was it that destroyed or conquered the Greek Empire? That would be the Romans, yeah. And who conquered the Romans? They were there for a long time, but they eventually fell apart, and then they were invaded various times, various ways. There's lots of things. It wasn't just one empire that came and took over, although there was an empire that grew out of that empire, which would have been the Holy Roman Empire, which was neither Roman nor holy. But that's what they called themselves, and trying to take on the prestige of the earlier days of Rome. And they had the same general land area, but then things kind of fell apart, and we have now the European nations, right? That's where all that came from. And, of course, America's tied into that too somehow. But interesting how things work, and who knows what's going to happen next. But all these things were because of this time period where there was nation after nation being destroyed, one after the other after the other. And these were empires that were destroying empires, right? They would become well, you destroy an empire, you get to take over the land. And so this is basically the same area and the same people, but different leaders. And so there are a lot of different things that were instituted. So when you see in the book of Revelation, there's a depiction of this great beast that comes up out of the sea, and it's a conglomeration of all these different beasts that were mentioned in the book of Daniel. Daniel mentions, we got the beast that came out of the sea that was like a lion. We got the one that's, I don't remember the order. We got the one that was like a bear. We have the one that was, what was the other one? The leopard. And what? No, I don't think there was an eagle. The fourth one was actually not described. And if you go back and look, we also have in the book of Daniel, we have the great statue, the gold, silver, and copper, and then the bronze. These are all representations of one kingdom after another in succession. And we don't see that right now, but things kind of were coming to a head, and the reason everything was coming to a head was what was the purpose of all this turmoil and changing of nations, and what was God bringing about?
He was setting up earth for the Messiah.
He was setting up the earth for the Messiah to come. That's right. So that's what this was all about, and it's kind of, I wouldn't say settled down, but it settled down in one way with the nations conquering nations. It's not quite as much as it was in those times. Things have changed dramatically over the last 2,000 years, but and I don't know if there was really, if you can say that even before this time, the Babylonians, before that there were kingdom fighting kingdom, but it was not like this, not to this degree. Anyway, it's interesting. We have in chapter 3, though, we have a prayer, and that's what we're going to look at here in the last 15 minutes or so. Prayer of Habakkuk the prophet on Shigionoth, and no one knows what that word means. I haven't seen everything I've looked up said, we don't know what it means. O Lord, I have heard your speech and was afraid. O Lord, revive your work in the midst of the years. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. God came from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran. His glory covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. His brightness was like the light. He had rays flashing from his hand, and there was power. There his power was hidden. Before him went pestilence, and fever followed at his feet. He stood and measured the earth, and looked and startled the nations. The everlasting mountains were scattered. The perpetual hills bowed. His ways are everlasting. I saw in the tents of Cushan an affliction. The curtains of the land of Midian trembled. O Lord, were you displeased with the rivers? Was your anger against the rivers? Was your wrath against the sea that you rode on your horses, your chariots of salvation? Your bow was mighty, was made quite ready. Oaths were sworn over your arrows. You divided the earth with rivers. The mountains saw you and trembled. The overflowing of the water passed by. The deep uttered its voice, lifted its hands on high. The sun and moon stood still in their habitation. At the light of your arrows they went, the shining of your glittering spear. You marched through the land in indignation. You trampled the nations in anger. You went forth for the salvation of your people, for salvation with your anointed. You struck the head from the house of the wicked by laying bare from foundation to neck. You thrust through with his own arrows the head of his villages. They came out like a whirlwind to scatter me. Their rejoicing was like feasting on the poor and in secret. You walked through the sea with your horses, through the heap of great waters. When I heard, my body trembled, my lips quivered at the voice. Rottenness enters my bones, and I trembled in myself that I might rest in the day of trouble. When he comes up to the people, he will invade them with his troops. Though the fig tree may not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, though the labor of the olive may fail, and the fields yield no food, though the flock may cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation. The Lord God is my strength. He will make my feet like deer's feet, and he will make me walk on my high heels. Okay, let's look at this here, and talk about some of these things. Verse 2, I have heard your speech and was afraid, O Lord, revive your works in the midst of the years. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, your remembrance. So we have a recognition here of what is he recognizing? What is he seeing here? What's this verse about?
He recognizes who God is.
All right. Yes. Recognition of God's nature, his power, his strength. He says, I've heard your speech and was afraid. He says, revive your work in the midst of the years and make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. So he's asking for God to make himself known. And making himself known is going to be, especially in this context, if you just think about what we've already read in this whole chapter, is the destruction and the punishment that's coming. And he's saying, please, when you do this, remember mercy as well. There's going to be mercy that can come. We have his appearance that came in verses 3 through 7. It says that the Holy One came from Mount Paran. His glory covered the heavens. All right, the earth was full of his praise. And there are a lot of passages that relate to that, right? What is it that shows? There are a lot of answers to this question, but what is it that shows God's greatness? What is it that shows God to be powerful and wise and strong? How does the earth show God's power? All right. All right, so we have wisdom in the seasons and how he's created everything. That's right. And the scriptures are clear that the very fact that they exist at all shows his power, doesn't it? So he's a creator of all things. Where did he get the material to create the world and the universe? He just created it. Yeah, he just made it. So it's like that old joke that we all have probably heard. Scientists came to God and said, we don't need you anymore because we can create all kinds of things in a laboratory. And he says, okay, we have a challenge, create man. And so the scientists started working on their little chemicals and pouring chemicals in different places, trying to get things to create flesh to start with. And God came to them and said, no, get your own dirt. In other words, you can't even begin to start putting things together to create humans without some kind of raw material, but God spoke into existence things that were not. And it's mind-boggling to think about that. I mean, someone else, this is another argument that people have made for God. Try to create something in your mind that is not related to anything else you've ever seen or heard. It's impossible. Because in our mind, we only work with information that we have. Now, you can say, well, I can create a monster in my head that's never existed. Yes, you can, but you're going to have pieces of it from different things. And it doesn't matter where you draw from. You're going to draw from something that you've seen or heard, your five senses have touched. And so you can't really create anything new. It's going to be pieces of old that are put together. So when we're talking about creating something, we have this phone in our pockets that is a huge creation. It took a lot of time. But this is nothing but a step beyond what was before, right? And it's a big step beyond what it was, but it's still a step. Where did they get the idea of having video in your hand? Well, did video exist before this technology existed? Of course it did. And where did that come from? Well, we have lots of things that have been built up over the years. But God, when he spoke, he not only created from nothing, he had in mind what he was going to create before it ever existed. That is absolutely mind-boggling that he could do that. And this is one of the greatest arguments that we have that God is real and exists. All this came from somewhere. And even the most hardened atheist will admit that is the case. But, it's interesting how now what they are desperately trying to figure out is how they can explain nothingness to actually be something. And There's no way for them. It's still going to be the chicken and egg controversy. I heard an atheist the other day said, the question is whether there's a chicken or an egg was first, right? He said, but this is not even a discussion. It's not even an issue. We know this for a fact. It was the egg. Had to have been. Some non-chicken gave birth to a chicken. Had a chicken egg. That's the only way it could have happened. I'm like, you still haven't answered the question because it can't happen. So, they'll change, but they're still chickens. Yeah.
You know, Jason, a lot of people believe that the Big Bang agrees with Genesis, but there's a fundamental flaw. Genesis makes it very plain. God created the earth first. He created the earth because he knew he was going to put man in it. Then he created everything else. That's what Genesis says. And that ain't what Big Bang says.
No, that's true. There's a lot of discrepancy. And there are people who, I was talking to a man the other day from Apologetics Press who, if you haven't heard that, go online and find them. They're an organization from the church, excellent. They're scientists that are putting together incredible. They have debates, and it's incredible work they're doing. And Carla was talking to one of them, and she told me about this, said that one of the things that they talked about, one of the problems that they have is people will write in and they're wanting to argue about the stuff that they're presenting. Of course, you expect that. He said the most he gets is from people who believe in theistic evolution. They want to prove that the Bible teaches evolution. And they're teaching against evolution because the Bible doesn't teach that. And so he said the most argumentation we get are people who claim to be Christians who want to believe that evolution and the Bible coincide. And he said they don't. They're oil and water, which is true. Now, we can go into a whole lot of detail about this, and I didn't intend to, but if you think about it, evolution is true in one perspective. That is, things change. We evolve. We're taller now than we've ever been. But you know what? If you go back 6,000 years and people were this tall, and now we've grown to this tall, there's a change. We've evolved into that. No question about that. But if you go back 6,000 years to those people who were this tall, were they humans? Yes. We've always been human. And a human can't give birth to a non-human. It's not going to happen. And so I had a scientist when my son was in school, he was teaching class, and of course my son was struggling. He didn't know how to answer the questions because he knew what the teacher wanted and he knew what the truth was, and he didn't want to put the truth because then he'd get a failing grade. So I went and had a discussion with the scientist, and I said, let's work something out. Is it okay with you if he puts the answer that you want in quotation marks as a representation that, yes, this is what you teach, but it's not what I believe? He said, that'll be fine. If you want to do it that way, that'll be fine. And he stopped me and he said, but I want to ask you why you don't believe in evolution. I said, I don't believe the Bible teaches it. He said, yeah, but have you ever heard of the people that have webbed fingers? This is where we're heading. I said, what do you mean? He said, they have web fingers. He said, they're ideal for swimming. We're heading back to the ocean. We're eventually going to be evolving back into the ocean. I said, well, when we get there, are we still going to be human? He said, well, yeah. I said, then you still haven't proven evolution. Just because you have webbed hand doesn't mean that you're something different. You're still a human being, but you have a difference, right? And that was a abnormality that probably will not last, but who knows? I don't know what the future holds. Anyway, sorry to get off on that, but there's so much there. And so you can go through chapter 3. I realize what I just did is wasted a lot of time instead of going through this, but we have the recognition of God's might, and that's listed in verse 2. We have God's appearance that's shown to us in verses 3 through 7. We have God's past actions in verses 8 through 15. And how this is all symbolic language, or it could actually be literal. Then we have his response in verse 16, his response to God's recognition of God's power and might. And this is where I wanted to point us to, is when we're facing challenges and things in life that are difficult or hard for us, they're hard to understand, or maybe they're hard for us to wrap our minds around and accept. The conclusion is that we should look at who God is, look at his nature, remember who he is, the promises that he's made, the way he's behaved in the past, and sit in awe of God again. The questions that we have are not nearly as important as the one that we're asking the questions of. And we need to keep first things first. God is the one. And remember the book of Job, the first 38 chapters were all about how unsatisfied Job was in these questions that he had about God. And then God appears to him in the whirlwind, and what's Job's reaction to that? I'm just dust and ashes. Forgive me for not seeing who you really are. That's basically what we get. And God showed him. And so in the questions, we may not get answers. We may never, even in heaven, may never know some of the answers to these questions. But the only thing that matters is that God is there. And he is the one who knows, he's the one who's done, and he is the only explanation for these things that we can have. And with that in mind, I think it'll help us through any of the challenges that we face. All right. Well, thank you very much for your participation.